Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, let me get the screen share on. Hold on.
Hi, Rabbi. Hi,
Hello. Hi, John.
Hello.
Hi, Dennis.
Hello, everybody.
Hello. Good to see everyone.
Jeff.
I did get an apology from Kent that he might be running late. But otherwise, it looks like most of our regulars are here. Hold on. Just going to share the screen. Just grabbing the link. Hold on.
It's a complicated process.
Right. It's for some reason when I use it for different accounts, then it resets and I lose the settings and I have to start over. Okay, I think we got it now. I'm going to just mute everyone in the meantime, so no background noise. And okay, Shakach, just on 1 o'clock, and we'll get started. The contents of today's chapter is a continuation from the laws of the Korban Chatat that we've been learning about, but introduces some really interesting, unique laws to the Korban Chatat, the sin offering, and touches on some fascinating principles in general in Jewish laws relating to kashrut and so on. The first couple of halachot are going to speak about a very unique mitzvah to the laws of the Korban Chatat, the sin offering, and that is if from the time you collect the blood of the sin offering and it's in the vessel, before you get a chance to actually sprinkle that blood, if some of that blood ends up on a garment, there's a special mitzvah that blood needs to be washed off within the temple courtyard. Okay, that's the basic mitzvah that we're talking about, and we're going to speak about the parameters of that mitzvah. And then we're going to discuss one or two other points as we get there. So the first halacha says as follows: there's a stringency that applies with regard to an animal brought as a sin offering that does not apply to other sacrifices of the most sacred order. And this is it. If blood from an animal brought as a sin offering will spew from the container in which the blood was received onto a garment, so one of the garments that the Kohen is wearing, before the blood was sprinkled onto the altar, remember the sprinkling is the critical part of the offering, that garment is obligated to be washed with water in the temple courtyard. As it states, if its blood is spewed on a garment, that which has been spewed upon must be washed in a holy place. So we're not talking here, what's interesting is we're talking about a special law. We're not talking here about removing impurity. We're also not talking about obviously keeping the Kohen's garments clean, because that has to be done anyway. But we're talking specifically about this blood being removed, and we'll see how it's done within the temple courtyard. Okay, halacha 2. A garment made from wool or linen, a soft hide, or a garment from goat's hair is required to be washed. A firm hide, like thick leather, however, is considered as wood, and one should scrape the blood from it. So we'll see what washing means and what wiping off or scraping means. The above applies to the blood of sin offerings that are eaten or those which are burnt, right? There was chatas and this repes, there was the chatas offering that gets burnt, and then there's the chatas offering that gets eaten. All types of chatat offerings, sin offerings, the blood from an animal needs to be washed off within the temple courtyard, but not of a sin offerings from a fowl, as implied, because the pasuk that The pasuk that obligates us in this mitzvah to remove the blood, when in the courtyard says tishachet tachata, it says the sin offering will be slaughtered, meaning the Torah is speaking of offerings that get slaughtered, not that get killed by malika. Remember, the bird, the way we prepare the bird for the offering is that it gets the neck gets sliced, broken from behind with the nail. It's not shechted like an animal. So this law applies only to an animal that is, or an offering, i.e. an animal, that is shechted, that is ritually slaughtered. Halacha 3. When a sin offering was disqualified, its blood need not be washed from garments. In other words, he'll speak this out a little bit. This applies whether there was a time when it could have been acceptable, or there was never a time when it could have been acceptable. What's meant by an offering that had a time when it could have been acceptable? One which was left overnight, that became impure, but was taken outside the temple courtyard. In other words, like this, when you offer, the question of the halacha he's dealing with is, you've shechted your animal, you've collected the blood, right? And before you had a chance to sprinkle the blood, which would be the completion of the process of the sacrifice of the offering, that animal now becomes no longer fit to continue with the offering. Okay, so he's saying then this mitzvah to wash off that blood that then goes onto a garment would no longer apply. It only applies to the blood that goes onto a garment for a chatat offering that will actually be offered. Now, so he says there's times when you may have slaughtered the animal, and when you slaughtered it and were intending to bring it, everything was in order, but then something happened. Either the time frame that it was supposed to be brought in elapsed, or somehow it became impure, was taken out of the temple courtyard. So whether that's the reason why this chatat is no longer being brought, or whether it's because it was never acceptable. What is the case when it's never acceptable? That's what we're going into now. One that was disqualified because of the manner in which it was slaughtered, or the manner in which its blood was sprinkled. So in those cases, then the blood is not subject to this mitzvah that we are speaking about. Halacha 4, only the place where the blood was absorbed must be washed. So this particular washing away of the blood is not washing the entire garment, which is, by the way, one of the points that makes it clear to us that this is not a concept of tumah, ritual impurity, which would require the entire garment to be washed. You just have to wash the place where the blood is. He says the above applies provided the garment or utensil is susceptible to contract ritual impurity and is fit to be washed. So again, what type of garment must it be? So it must be a garment that's fit to be receptive to tumah. So again, within the laws of ritual purity and impurity, these concepts are discussed obviously more in length, and the framework is provided. But not every material or every garment is susceptible to tumah, ritual impurity. If the blood, again, it was in the vessel before it had been sprinkled, went onto such a garment that was not susceptible to ritual impurity, this mitzvah would not apply. So again, although this is not a concept of ritual purity and impurity in and of itself, it only applies to a utensil or to a garment that would otherwise be susceptible to ritual impurity. However, if the blood spews on a wooden utensil or a metal utensil, it need not be washed because it is not fit to be washed. Instead, one should merely scrape the blood off. Really, what he's saying is that when you're talking about a garment, the blood gets absorbed in it and needs to get washed through. When you're talking about something that's got a hard surface, you would just have to wipe it off, or if it's dried up, scrape it off. You don't have to wash it, which is the mitzvah that we are talking about. If the blood spewed onto the skin of a fish, okay, I'm not sure what the skin of the fish would be doing there in the temple courtyard, but if it did, it is not necessary to wash it, but the skin of the fish is not susceptible to ritual impurity. So there's an example of something that's not susceptible to tumah. If it was spewed onto the hide of an animal that was not skinned, so like this, animal hide, depending on the stage of its processing, will determine whether or not it's receptive to tumah. So long as the hide is on an animal, it's not susceptible to tumah as a garment. And so if this blood spewed out onto the animal before it was skinned, it need not be washed. If ever the hide was skinned from the animal, even though it hasn't been fully processed, it must be washed. Right, even though it is not susceptible to ritual purity in its present state. It will be susceptible to ritual impurity after it has been treated. It has gone through full processing. There, it's a piece of leather, and therefore, in that instance, the Rambam says it would also be required to wash it off within the temple courtyard as per this particular unique mitzvah. Halacha 6. If blood spewed from the animal's neck onto a garment, it's sputtered from the corner of the altar onto a garment. So here he's talking about, remember we said this mitzvah applies particularly to the blood that was collected in the vessel at the time of Shechita. But and it's from that vessel that the Kohen was going to then go and sprinkle it onto the altar, as we've learned, right? So if blood spewed directly from the animal onto a garment, that's not the blood we're talking about here that is particular to this mitzvah. Similarly, if the Kohen actually sprinkled the blood onto the altar and then it spritzed off onto him, that is also not the blood that we're talking about, or the blood spilled on the floor of the temple courtyard. It was gathered and it spewed onto a garment. Or if you picked up blood from the floor into a vessel. So it's in a vessel, but it didn't go directly from the animal into the vessel. So in all these instances, there's no requirement that the garment be washed, as the prefix press, and as the verse states, if its blood is spewed. Implied is that the requirement was stated only with regard to the blood that was received in a sacred utensil and is fit to be sprinkled on the altar because it is of sufficient measure to be sprinkled. He's just emphasizing here that if the blood ended up on a garment at any other stage of the process or had not been collected properly into this vessel to be sprinkled, it's not susceptible to this mitzvah. Now, of course, you're going to wash those garments to come back and have clean garments the next time you come in to serve in the temple. The point is not that you don't wash it. You would wash it for obvious reasons, cleanliness and so on, but not in the fulfillment of this mitzvah. And therefore, the washing is done outside of the temple courtyard. What's unique over here is that this washing must take place within the temple courtyard. Okay. If the 4 presentations of blood were made, remember, so when you sprinkle, it gets sprinkled on the 4 corners of the altar. So if these 4 presentations were made, and then some of the remainder of the blood spewed from the container onto the garment, again, it need not be washed, even though the remainder of the blood was not yet poured out at the base of the altar, because we're talking about, again, he's clarifying, it's only up until the sprinkling. Once the sprinkling has been done, it's no longer subject to this particular mitzvah. Similar principles apply with regard to the sin offerings that are burnt. Halacha 8, if the blood of a sin offering sputtered from a priest's finger after he performed its sprinkling with his hand. So let's say, right, he's got to do 4 sprinklings, 1 on each corner of the altar. Let's say he came to the first corner and he sprinkled onto the altar. And some of the blood that he had sprinkled, let's say, I don't know, he touches his shirt. So now, even though he hasn't finished all 4 of the sprinklings, but the amount that came out from which he took out in order to sprinkle, that's already been used, and that too would not be subject to this mitzvah. That need not be washed because the remainder of the blood on his finger is not acceptable for sprinkling. Right? It's done. Halacha 9. If the blood spewed from one garment to another, the second garment need not be washed. So if somehow it's from the vessel, it's after it was collected from the animal, it's before the sprinkling. So it's the type of blood that we're talking about that would require washing within the temple courtyard. But it fell first onto one garment and then from there onto another garment. The second garment doesn't have to be washed, only the first one. If blood from a sin offering sputtered onto a garment and then ordinary blood sputtered onto the blood from the sin offering, it must be washed. In other words, even though other blood is now mixed into it, it doesn't cancel it out. It must be washed in the temple courtyard. If I have ordinary blood or even blood from a burnt offering sputtered onto a garment, now it's not from this vessel, and then the blood from the sin offering sputtered onto it, in other words, onto the same spot on that garment, then it's not required to be washed because the blood from the sin offering is not absorbed in the garment. What the Rambam is basically saying is that if there's blood already in the garment, and now the blood that we're concerned about falls on that exact same spot, we consider it that the blood is basically falling onto other blood and not falling into the garment. And therefore it wouldn't be subject to this mitzvah of washing it in the courtyard. Okay, halacha 10. When the place stained by the blood is washed, it should be washed very thoroughly with water until no trace of the blood remains. All of the 7 detergents that are used to determine whether a stain is blood or not should be used to wash away the blood of a sin offering, with the exception of urine. The urine should not be brought into the temple. Basically, there is a halacha like this, that when it comes to a blood stain, this is why by within the context of a woman's menstrual cycle, or trying to determine if a certain stain on a garment is actually blood, and therefore would indicate ritual purity from the individual that it came from or otherwise. So the halacha dictates that there are certain products that one would use to try and wash away that blood. If it doesn't wash, if it washes away, then we know it's blood. If it doesn't wash away, then we know that perhaps it's some other type of dye, and there would be no tumor. So what he's saying is over here, he's telling us exactly how this washing takes place. Again, we know, so that the blood of the sin offering from the vessel, before it's been sprinkled, spritzes onto somebody's garment or something else, you have to wash it within the temple courtyard. That's the mitzvah we're talking about. What do you wash it with? Water plus one of these other substances. Now, one of those substances that was sometimes used was urine. It seems like, when I was preparing this, I was thinking about all those, everybody's talking about how to get rid of that little, the paint from the these stains. How do you get rid of stains? So there was different things that they used to use to get rid of the blood stains. And if it got rid of it, you knew it was blood. If it didn't get rid of it, you knew it was something else. So the point being over here is that because you know what you're rinsing out is blood, you must use something that is going to thoroughly clean it out. Okay? One of those things that was sometimes used was urine, but you're not allowed to bring urine to the temple. So that couldn't be used because, again, this washing was done specifically within the temple courtyard. Halacha 11. Now, okay, so now we're moving on to the next thing. Up until here, we've spoken about blood from the chatat, the sin offering, that goes into a vessel, into a garment, or onto a vessel, and so on, must be cleaned off in the temple courtyard. Now we're going to talk about something else. And some of it's particular to the sin offering. Some of it applies more broadly to the other offerings. As we've already learned, every offering has specifications. One of the specifications is the time frame within which it can be eaten. What happens if you haven't eaten the portion of the offering that you were meant to eat within that time frame? That meat is now considered noisar, it's been left over, and it's forbidden to eat that meat. Okay? Let's say you took meat from the korban. Again, we'll say specific things about the korban chatas soon, but more broadly, it applies to all korbanot. Let's say that portion of the animal that you're going to eat, you need to cook it before you eat it. You're going to be cooking it in a vessel. Now, we know from the laws of kashrut, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but this concept, this theme is dealt with a lot more in kashrut, but a residue, a taste of the food that you cook within a pot gets absorbed into the so-called walls of that pot, right? That's why, for example, that's why we need separate dishes for milk and meat, because your milk dishes absorb some of the taste of the milk, even if it's completely clean. You can't use that for meat and vice versa, because it draws into the walls of the utensil taste. So now what happens like this? You've cooked your korban in a pot. Some residue of that korban is now in the pot. Can you eat that residue? Of course not. It's stuck in the pot. So what happens after the time frame of that korban happens? That minuscule taste residue within the walls of the pot is now no longer kosher. So therefore, you actually have to kasher those utensils before the time passes. So for a chatat, it will be that day and before the next morning. For, I think it's a shlomim, right? You have extra time to eat it another day. But within that time frame, you're going to have to make sure you kasher that vessel so that it doesn't remain with a residue or a taste of the korban after the time frame that the korban is allowed to be eaten, because now you end up having some absorbed substance that is not permissible. And as we'll see, just as in the general laws of kashrut, certain types of vessels cannot be kashered and therefore must be broken. Those that can be kashered, as we'll see, must be kashered within the time frame. And what's unique to the korban chatat, as we'll see in the laws of the Rambam here, is that kashering must take place like the cleansing of the blood within the temple courtyard. With all other korbanot, that's not going to be an essential component, but with the cooked parts of a korban chatat, it must take place within the temple courtyard. And as he'll also say, it must be specific to those chatat offerings that are intended to be eaten. Chatat offerings that are intended to be burnt, if someone took a portion of that and cooked some of it, that itself was not permissible. Then it would seem you can't really kasher that dish at all because it's immediately prohibited. But when you cooked in a permissible way, your chatat, your sin offering, you don't want the time to elapse with the residue absorbed into the utensil, and you have to do whatever it takes to kasher it. So we'll see in the first instance, in Halacha 11, he says like this: an earthenware vessel in which a sin offering that is to be eaten was cooked must be broken. Now again, the reason why you have to break it is because it has no way to kasher it. That's what's unique about earthenware vessels. You cannot kasher them. Once they absorb whatever it is that's prohibited, it's not kosherable. And the only thing you do is to break it. So for an earthenware vessel, what you have to do is you have to break it within the temple courtyard. A metal vessel in which a sin offering was cooked, what do you need to do? You need to kasher it. What is the process of kashering it? It must be cleansed and rinsed in water. Cleansed means that you've got to scrub it with hot water, as we'll see, and rinsing it down with cold water. So, and again, that process of kashering, as it were, must take place within the temple courtyard. Again, and he learns this from the fact that this law of koshering, it comes immediately after the law that we just spoke about in the Torah, the pasuk, that the blood needs to be cleansed within the temple courtyard. And he says, so this koshering process similarly must be done within the temple courtyard. And as the verse says, an earthenware vessel in which it is cooked shall be broken. Now, although this verse does not state in a holy place, the same law that applies to washing a garment apply. That's what he's saying. It doesn't say it explicitly, but because it comes immediately after that law, we apply the same detail. Just as the washing must be performed in a sacred place, so to the breaking of the earthen vessel and the cleansing and rinsing of a metal utensil must be performed in a holy place. These laws apply equally to a utensil in which the sin offering was cooked and one into which it was poured while it was boiling. The point is, if the meat of the offering was in the vessel in such a way that the vessel would absorb some of its taste, you need to go ahead and do whatever the kashering process is that is necessary, and you have to do it within the temple courtyard. So now he clarifies, what is this merika, the cleansing? So he says merika is done with hot water. What is shtifa, rinsing? That's done with cold water. And he said the proof text mentions water. Why does it say water? To exclude wine or wine mixed with water or other liquids. So the kashering process, or the thorough cleansing and rinsing of the vessel, should resemble the thorough cleansing and rinsing of a cup. Now, if you're familiar with the laws of kashrut, generally, and how do you kosher something? So something you cook within, you then use just hot water to extract the taste from within. But what happens if you cook directly over fire? So he says, for example, a spit and a grill, which is used to cook the meat of this sin offering, because it's used under direct fire, so then it needs to be purged in water that is heated by fire and then washed in cold water. So you need to have a more direct, you can't just take hot water and rub it. You actually have to immerse it in, or you have to pour water of it while it's on the source of heat. So it needs a higher level of heated water in order to extract the taste of the carbon so that it doesn't end up becoming prohibited with the taste within it. Halacha 13. When does the Vav apply? When one cooked sacrificial meat in these utensils after their blood was sprinkled as required by law. If having cooked in these utensils before the sprinkling of the blood, or he cooked meat from sin offering that were to be burnt in such utensils, it's not necessary that they be washed thoroughly and rinsed. Meaning they don't have to be kashered within the courtyard. In fact, it would seem that they can't be kashered in this way, because everything that we're talking about here is that you're doing the kashering process before it actually becomes prohibited. In these examples, immediately when you're cooking it, you're doing it at a time when you weren't allowed to, and immediately what you're doing is prohibited. So immediately whatever taste goes into these utensils is prohibited. So either what the Rambam is saying is that you can't kasher it, or such a thing you would have to kasher outside of the temple, not this mitzvah where you're kashering in anticipation and it's done within the courtyard of the temple. If I cook the meat of the sin offering, in only a portion of the utensil, the entire utensil must be washed thoroughly and rinsed. In other words, if you say it only touched part of the pan or the pot, nonetheless, because in line with the laws of kashrut and absorbing, it's considered to absorb into the walls of this utensil, and the whole thing is considered to have absorbed it. We don't differentiate one part of the pot from the other. The whole thing needs to go through this process of kashering as well. Now, there's an unresolved doubt concerning the ruling when meat from sacrificial offering was roasted in the space of an earthenware oven. So we spoke about a pot, really, and then we spoke about a spit or a grate upon which the food goes directly. Okay, but what happens if you have an oven? So it's a direct source of heat, but you've got something within it. So must the oven be destroyed since the meat was cooked inside of it, or need it not be destroyed since it did not touch it? So you put a pot within an earthenware oven. We said earthenware vessels, the only way to kasher them is by breaking them. But in this instance, in the first earthenware vessel we spoke of was like a pot where the food, is directly in the pot and is cooking in the pot. It's directly absorbed. Here, it would be a second degree away because it would be in some type of pot or something within the oven. So the question is, does that taste get absorbed into the walls of the oven, even though it's not direct, or not? If it does get absorbed directly, then technically the only way to deal with this oven is to break it. So he says there's a doubt. The above does not apply only with regard to a sin offering. Instead, all utensils that we use for meat from sacrificial offerings with hot water, whether sacrifices of the highest degree of sanctity or sacrifices of a lesser degree of sanctity, are required to be washed thoroughly and rinsed after the time for eating from them. Similarly, a spit and a grill should be purged of after eating from the sacrifice which they were used to cook. In other words, what everything that we said about the chatat that has to be done within the temple courtyard applies to the other sacrifices as well. That process of cleansing, although in those instances, wouldn't have to be done specifically in the temple courtyard. Okay, they should not be left until one desires to eat from them a second time, right? You don't wait until you're going to use it a second time. Instead, when the time for eating from them is completed, one should purge the grill and the spit and wash thoroughly and rinse the utensils, whether it be a metal utensil or earthenware utensil. There's one exception: the meat from a sin offering. An earthenware utensil in which it was cooked must be broken. Nevertheless, one may cook in a utensil and do so a second and third time immediately, whether using a metal utensil or earthenware utensil. The requirement to wash it thoroughly and rinse it applies only at the conclusion of the time permitted to partake from these sacrificial foods. What he's saying is like this, is that if you're going to use one pot to cook from a few different chatat offerings, that's fine, so long as you have not yet reached the end time for when you are required to have eaten the first one. So, in other words, although the absorbed taste from the first one, eventually, if it's allowed to stay beyond the framework of time when the original sacrifice must be eaten, it will become prohibited. It's not currently prohibited. And therefore, you can reuse that vessel to cook a few different meats from offerings up until that point when it's required, to that moment when you would be required to kasher it before you extend beyond the time when it becomes prohibited. Now, here he's going to talk about one or two types of material that is considered not to actually absorb the taste of that which is cooked inside it and would not require this kashering process. So he says utensils made from animal turds, stone, or earth. And here, earthenware vessel we spoke about before are those that have already gone into the kiln and are completed. Earth over here means like almost an unfinished earthenware vessel. So these do not require to be thoroughly washed and rinsed, even when the meat of the sin offering was cooked in them. All that is necessary is that they be cleansed, because these particular materials we understood not to absorb the taste of the meat. With regard to a sin offering, so the verse says, anything that will touch its meat will become sanctified, meaning it will be of the same status. If it has been disqualified, anything that touches it is also disqualified. If it is kosher, anything that touches it should be eaten according to the laws that apply to it with the same degree of holiness. What he's talking about here is another aspect of law as well. What is if he had the meat of the chatas and it touched another piece of meat? So what we're saying, so again here, there's a whole area in the laws of kashrut that speak about this, of how taste from one item to another may or may not get transferred, whether it gets transferred into the entirety of the second item or whether it just affects the surface of the second item. But what he is saying over here is that the holiness of the chatat, in instances where it does transfer, will transfer the holiness. So if you have a piece of meat from a chatas offering, and this will apply to other offerings as well, as we'll see, and then you have a regular piece of meat from your butcher, and the two come together, and let's say they were warm and they were both quite moist, then this piece of meat that was just from the butcher would take on the holiness of the chatat, and therefore would have the same framework and restrictions of the chatat, that it can only be eaten in the places that it can be eaten, and can only be eaten during the time that it can be eaten, and only by the people who are allowed to eat it. Right? So if it's something that only the kohen can eat within the temple compound, then before the next morning, that's when it must be eaten, this other piece of meat. So this is another concept of the transfer of taste, and therefore also transfer of status from one piece of meat to another. So, and he'll talk this out a little bit. When does the Bava apply? When the flavor of the meat of a sacrifice offering was absorbed by it. If it merely touched it, but its flavor was not absorbed, it does not cause it to become sanctified. So, I mean, this can happen in different ways, but technically speaking, if you had two pieces of cold meat without any moisture, it would not be considered to transfer anything. But if you had two pieces of hot meat that are moist, that filled with moisture, then it would be considered to have transferred. The Bava applies both to a sin offering and any other sacrificial offering, whether sacrifices of a lesser degree of sanctity or sacrifices of a severe degree of sanctity. As implied by the verse, this is the law, the burnt offering, the meal offering, and it goes on and it lists all the different types of offerings. So this concept that as soon as the taste from one gets transferred, absorbed into something else, it transfers the status, would apply to all types of korbanot. 17, if the meat of the sacrificial offering touched a cake. So a cake means basically it's like a matzah. So because it's dry and hard, and it doesn't, therefore it's understood that the meat does not then flavor of the meat doesn't get absorbed into it. The cake does not become sanctified in its entirety. Instead, one should just cut off the portion in which it was absorbed. In other words, on the surface, you'd cut off just the part that touched the korban, and the rest of it can be treated as normal. Halacha 18. Following law applies to utensil in which sacrificial food and ordinary food were cooked together, or sacrifices of the highest degree of sanctity were cooked together with the sacrifices of a lesser degree of sanctity. So here you're talking about that they were cooked together. So certainly then there's a transfer of taste. So if there's a sufficient amount of the sacrificial food to impart its flavor, meaning that it's not overwhelmed by more than 1 in 60, that's the general rule, then the entire mixture must be eaten according to the laws governing the food of the most severe category. The utensil must be thoroughly washed and rinsed according to the laws governing the food of the most severe category. So if it was a chatat, it would have to be kashered within the temple compound, right? And before the following morning. If it did not impart its flavor to them, meaning let's say only a small little piece of the korban fell in, but there was more than 60 times the amount, then the food of the more lenient category need not be eaten according to the laws of the governing the food of the more severe category, and they're not governed by their laws at all. But the utensil in which the mixture was cooked to must thoroughly be washed and rinsed. So you still need to kasher then the utensil itself. Halacha 90, when the blood of a sin offering sputtered on a garment, and then that garment was taken. Okay, so now we've got technicalities. We're coming back to some of the previous laws. Right at the beginning, we spoke about the need to wash out a garment that got blood on it from the sin offering, and it must be washed within the temple compound. What happens if the blood got on the garment? Now that garment was taken out of the temple courtyard and becomes ritually impure. So now you've got a bit of a conundrum. What do you do? On the one hand, you need to wash it according to biblical law in the temple courtyard. On the other hand, we are prohibited from bringing in an impure garment into the temple. So it would seem like you're stuck. What do you do? Okay, so when the blood of a sin offering sputtered on a garment, and then that garment was taken out of the temple courtyard, it should be returned to the temple courtyard and washed there. So if it doesn't become rich and impure, you've got to bring it back, wash it there. But what should be done if the garment became impure outside the temple courtyard? Like I said, you got this conundrum. What do you do? On the one hand, you have a mitzvah to wash it in the temple courtyard, and if you wash it outside the temple courtyard, you're doing something that you're not allowed to do. On the other hand, you're not allowed to bring something that's ritually impure into the temple courtyard. Seems like you're stuck. So the Rambam offers an interesting solution. He says it should be torn so that it will become pure. Here also, there's a law basic like this, is if a garment or a vessel gets broken, it returns to its ritual purity. Okay? But here we got a bit of a conundrum. Because on the one hand, you need to find a way of bringing it back to a state of ritual purity without putting it in a mikveh, without putting it into water. Because as soon as you're putting it into water, it's as if you're washing it outside of the Temple Mount. So you need to find a way to make it impure. The only way to do that is to break it. On the other hand, you're not allowed to bring simply broken rubbish into the Beis Hamikdash. So this is basically what he's saying is like this. You've got to tear it in such a way that biblically it's considered ritually pure, but it's also still considered a valid garment. Okay, so that's the balance that we're looking for. There's quite a bit, there's technicality to that, but that's the principle. He says it should be torn so that it will become pure, and then he should bring it into the temple courtyard and wash it there. And he says he must leave intact the portion of the garment the size of a handkerchief. That's what would determine that it's still considered a garment. For the relevant verse speaks of a garment. You can only clean a garment, meaning a garment must be washed, not a piece of a garment. So even though the remnants of the garment are impure due to rabbinic decree, because of the remnant, the size of a handkerchief, since the majority of it is torn, it is ritually pure according to scriptural law and is permitted to be brought into the sanctuary to wash out the blood. Basically, what we're creating is a situation like this, that the garment that you're bringing into the temple, according to rabbinic law, would still be considered impure because it's still considered a garment, but biblically it's considered pure. And because you have a biblical mitzvah to wash it in the temple courtyard, you would be allowed to override that rabbinic concern. You can bring what is rabbinically impure into the courtyard in order to do a biblical mitzvah. Okay? And we'll see one or two in his final halachot, one or two similar examples where what you try to find is a balance where you'll achieve some level of purity that biblically it would be considered pure, but even though rabbinically it may not be considered pure, you would be able to bring it into the Beis Hamikdash in order to fulfill a biblical command. Halacha 21, when an earthenware utensil in which a sin offering was cooked was taken out of the temple courtyard. So again, now what you should have done was you should have broken it in the temple courtyard. Now you've taken it out. So what do? You bring it back and you break it. What happens if it becomes impure outside the temple courtyard? It should be perforated. Because you can't just break it, because then you're breaking it outside the temple courtyard. You're not allowed to do that. You also can't bring it in as it is. So he says the way the solution is you make a small perforation, a small root, that a small root could protrude through it, and then it's considered ritually pure, at least biblically, and then you bring it back into the temple courtyard, and there you break it. If it was broken with a larger hole, it should not be broken in the temple courtyard because only utensils are broken there. So you're trying to find a balance of breaking it enough that it becomes ritually pure, but not breaking it too much that it's no longer considered a vessel. Similarly, when a metal utensil, which sin offerings were cooked, you cooked the sin offering and then it was taken out of the temple courtyard. Again, it should have remained there and be kosher. If it was taken out, bring it back, thoroughly wash and rinse it, that process of koshering it. But if it became impure when it was taken out, what should you do? Its bottom should be open until it becomes pure, and then it should be brought back inside the temple courtyard. The metal should then be flattened so that the opening becomes closed. See, with metal, you can make a big hole in it. Now it's pure, and then you can remelt it to return it into a vessel. Now, even though doing that rabbinically would still be rendered impure, biblically it wouldn't, and you could do as we did with the previous item. Afterwards, it should be thoroughly washed and rinsed in the temple courtyard. If it was cooked in a copper utensil, it should be thoroughly washed and rinsed with water. Implied is that only utensils are thoroughly washed in the temple courtyard. So that's the balance you want. On the one hand, you want to undermine the fact that it's a vessel enough that it's not ritually impure anymore, becomes ritually pure, but you want it still to be considered a vessel so that when that it can be washed in accordance to fulfill the mitzvah of removing the blood of a utensil, koshering utensil within the temple courtyard. Okay, quite a lot in today's chapter. Let's go through the questions, see what we can remember. And I hope you managed to follow along with these unique laws. And as you can see, it touches on many different areas of halakha, which we didn't really get to fully explore, but hope made sense in the context. So first question, if the blood, a sin offering that became disqualified because it was left overnight, splashed onto one's clothing, do they need to be washed? So the answer is no, right? Only if it remains, right? It was very specific. It was the blood within the container so long as it's still a kosher offering. Does the entire garment require washing after the blood of a sin offering splashes on it, or only the area the blood was absorbed? Okay, correct. Only the area where the blood was absorbed would require. What should be done with a garment that absorbed blood from a sin offering and was taken out of the temple courtyard before it could be washed?
It's got to be brought back. Should be
Should
returned.
return to the temple.
First
and what's
return.
there.
Excellent, right? Unless, obviously, as we said, it became impure, and then we got all those details. May one use the same metal utensil to cook sacrificial meat multiple times? No, it must be thoroughly washed and rinsed before each use. Yes, only earthenware vessels may not be used. Only if one cooks them before the time when they may be eaten is complete. Can you reuse the vessel? So the answer is yes. As long as it's within the time, before it would become no longer kosher, as it were, for use.
Very complicated.
Okay, shukach. Yeah, well, there was kind of three distinct things, and each one relies on some other areas of halakha, but I hope we got some sense of what's going on there. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hello, to Zero.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Have a beautiful day further.
You too.
And Chodesh Tov coming up. We'll see you next month.
Bye.
Chodesh Tov.